He built one of the most trusted names in British entertainment across 3 decades. A man who could make 10 million people laugh on a Saturday night and then sell 60 million books to their kids. Then, within the space of 3 years, almost every part of that reputation came apart at once. A hidden microphone, a leaked transcript, a publisher that quietly walked away. This is the story of how David Walliams went from national treasure to a man fighting to be believed, and why the damage may not be finished yet. David Walliams spent most of his career being 2 different public figures at the same time. On television, he was the boundary-pushing comic behind Little Britain, a man who built a career on exaggerated characters, crude jokes, and shock value. In bookshops, he was something else entirely. The country's most successful living children's author, a writer whose name sat on dedicated shelves next to Roald Dahl. For years, that balancing act worked. Then a series of separate controversies, arriving from completely different directions, made it impossible to hold both identities together. The first cracks appeared not because of anything new, but because the culture around him had shifted. In the summer of 2020, the killing of George Floyd in the United States set off a wave of protests that spread around the world, and with it came a sweeping reassessment of British comedy that had aired for years without serious challenge. Little Britain, the sketch show that made Walliams and his comedy partner Matt Lucas household names, became one of the most visible casualties of that reassessment. Within days, Netflix, BBC iPlayer, and BritBox all pulled the series from their platforms, citing changing standards around what was acceptable to broadcast. The character at the center of the criticism was Desiree Devere, a role Walliams played using dark makeup, a wig, and exaggerated features to portray a black woman. What had aired for years with relatively little pushback was now being widely described as a straightforward racial stereotype dressed up as comedy. Matt Lucas faced similar criticism for characters of his own. Both men apologized publicly, acknowledging that performing other races through makeup had been the wrong choice, regardless of the intent behind it at the time. The criticism didn't stop at race, either. Critics went back through the show's treatment of disabled and transgender characters too, arguing that a lot of what had been sold as satire looked, in hindsight, much closer to simple mockery. A trimmed, heavily edited version of the show eventually returned to some platforms by 2022, but the original episodes have largely stayed off mainstream streaming ever since. For a while, that was the extent of the damage. Walliams apologized, kept writing books, and mostly avoided becoming the center of the ongoing debate about the show's legacy. What almost nobody realized at the time was that a much more personal problem had already been quietly created 2 years earlier, sitting untouched in footage nobody outside the production team had ever looked at. During filming for Britain's Got Talent at the London Palladium in January 2020, the judges wore microphones that stayed active during breaks between auditions, long after the cameras had technically stopped rolling for a particular act. Believing they were simply chatting privately with colleagues, the panel kept talking while the equipment kept recording. Nobody outside the production team seemed to know those recordings existed, let alone that they'd been kept for more than 2.5 years. That changed in November 2022, when The Guardian published a report built on transcripts of those recordings. According to the paper, Walliams had made crude remarks about at least 2 contestants during breaks in filming. One was an older contestant who'd made a joke at Walliams' expense after an unsuccessful audition. Once the man was off stage, Walliams was recorded repeatedly using a vulgar insult to describe him. In a separate moment, he made explicit and demeaning sexual comments about a female contestant after she had left the stage. Neither contestant had any idea their audition had led to that kind of commentary, and neither remark had anything to do with their actual performances. The response was immediate. Walliams apologized within days, saying the comments were part of a private conversation between colleagues that was never meant to be made public, and that he took full responsibility regardless of the context in which the words were said. Fremantle, the company that produces the show, called the language inappropriate and said it had spoken to Walliams about his future conduct. ITV distanced itself from the remarks as pressure built over whether he could keep his seat on the panel. Within weeks, his departure was confirmed, ending a run on the show that had started back in 2012 and had, by that point, defined a decade of his public image. That image mattered because of what the role had actually looked like on screen for 10 years. Since joining the panel alongside Simon Cowell, Amanda Holden, and Alicia Dixon, Walliams had built a reputation as the warm counterweight to Cowell's sharper judging style, the one who'd leave his seat to comfort a nervous teenager mid-audition or crack a joke to defuse an awkward moment rather than pile on. Audiences remembered him getting genuinely emotional over a dog act that went on to win an entire series. He won Best Judge at the National Television Awards more than once. Losing that seat wasn't just a job change. It pulled away one of the most visible platforms tied to an image built almost entirely around being kind, approachable, and safe for family television, at the exact moment that image was being called into question. Public reaction to the leak split in two different directions almost immediately. A lot of people focused on what the comments actually said about him, arguing they revealed something at odds with a caring persona built over a decade on screen. But a significant number of people focused somewhere else entirely, asking harder questions about how private, off-camera conversations had ended up in a national newspaper in the first place, and why the microphones had stayed on after filming had technically stopped for the day. That second question turned out to matter more than most people expected, because Walliams himself was about to make it the center of a legal case. Rather than simply accept what had happened, Walliams sued Fremantle in September 2023, arguing the company had misused his private information and broken UK data protection law by continuing to record him, without his knowledge, once the cameras weren't rolling on his performance. The claim put the responsibility back on the production company's practices rather than accepting the comments alone as the whole story. What came out during that legal process went well beyond the original leak. Court filings described serious psychological harm connected directly to the transcript's publication, including documentation from his psychiatrist describing him as dealing with ongoing, uncontrollable negative thoughts, including active suicidal thoughts, in the aftermath of the story breaking. The same filings alleged that other conversations picked up by those same active microphones touched on subjects that had absolutely nothing to do with the show at all, including his struggles with food addiction, the death of his father, and the collapse of his marriage. None of that material had been published, but its existence, sitting on a recording he never knew was still running, was central to his argument that the recording itself was the wrongdoing, independent of what he'd actually said. The case settled in November 2023. Fremantle issued a formal apology, and both sides described the resolution as amicable, though the financial terms were never made public. In its statement, the company acknowledged the genuine distress the leak had caused him, while also thanking him for a decade of contribution to the show's success. It was, on paper, a resolution. In practice, it did little to repair a reputation that had already absorbed two separate, overlapping controversies within roughly the same 3-year window. And a third one, far less publicized than the other two, was already quietly building behind the scenes. More than 2 years after that settlement, an entirely different crisis emerged, this time from inside the publishing world, that had made Walliams one of the wealthiest authors in the country. In December 2025, reports confirmed that HarperCollins UK had ended its publishing relationship with him entirely, saying it would not release any further titles under his name. The decision followed an internal investigation into his conduct that had reportedly wrapped up roughly a year earlier, in 2024, though nothing about it had become public until that point. According to reporting from The Telegraph, the investigation centered on allegations that junior female staff at the publisher had raised concerns about his behavior during private meetings. Some employees were reportedly advised not to be alone with him, and were told to work in pairs whenever direct contact with him was unavoidable. One staff member was said to have received a financial settlement after raising concerns through internal channels before eventually leaving the company. HarperCollins itself declined to comment on the specifics, citing its internal processes and a commitment to employee well-being, but confirmed publicly that the relationship had ended. Walliams responded through representatives with a firm denial, saying he had never been told about any specific allegation, had never been given a chance to respond to any claim, and was seeking legal advice over the publisher's decision. It's worth being clear here. These are allegations denied by Walliams, and there has been no public finding of wrongdoing through any court or tribunal. What is confirmed is that HarperCollins made the decision to permanently end the relationship shortly after Charlie Redmayne stepped down as chief executive and Kate Elton took over the role, with reporting suggesting the new leadership team was the driving force behind finally acting on the investigation's conclusions. This particular story never generated the same volume of headlines as the Britain's Got Talent leak, arriving as it did during the busy pre-Christmas news cycle and landing on top of a controversy the public already felt familiar with. But in purely financial terms, it may end up being the more significant blow of the two. Walliams had built a publishing catalog worth tens of millions of pounds in lifetime sales, encompassing more than 20 novels, several short story collections, and a string of picture books that had, at points, occupied entire dedicated sections of major bookshops, an almost unheard of achievement for a living author who started out as a television personality rather than an established novelist. To understand how someone builds that kind of dual career in the first place, it helps to go back to the beginning. David Edward Walliams was born in August 1971 in Wimbledon, London, the son of a transport engineer and a school laboratory technician, and grew up in the Surrey suburb of Banstead in a household with no real connection to show business. He studied drama at the University of Bristol, and during a summer with the National Youth Theatre, he met a fellow young performer named Matt Lucas, a friendship that would eventually define an entire era of British comedy. When he joined the Actors Union Equity, he discovered another performer already held the surname Williams, so he adjusted it slightly, and the stage name that would become a household word across Britain was created almost by accident. Through much of the 1990s, the two built a slow, steady reputation on the Edinburgh comedy circuit and through a spoof sketch show called Rock Profile, developing the kind of exaggerated, character-driven comedy that would eventually become Little Britain. That show launched on BBC Radio in 2000 before moving to television in 2003, and it turned into a genuine national phenomenon almost overnight, with catchphrases and characters recognized across the entire country and audiences approaching 10 million viewers at its peak. It won major comedy awards for 3 years running and spun off an American adaptation, a stage tour, and a spin-off series before Lucas eventually moved on to other projects. Alongside all of that, Walliams built an entirely separate identity through extreme physical charity challenges, most famously swimming the length of the English Channel in 2006 and roughly 140 miles down the River Thames in 2011, an effort that nearly broke him physically but raised well over £1 million for charity and dramatically reshaped how the public saw him, shifting the image away from pure comedy and towards something people genuinely admired. That same period saw the launch of his children's book career, starting with The Boy in the Dress in 2008, which grew into one of the most commercially successful catalogs in British publishing history. Then, in 2012, he joined the Britain's Got Talent panel, cementing the third and final leg of a career built on comedy, charity, and children's fiction all running at the same time. It's that combination that makes the last few years feel like such a sharp reversal. Commentators inside the industry have increasingly described the scandals as connected rather than coincidental, arguing that a performer who spent decades balancing a genuinely provocative, boundary-pushing public persona against a parallel role as the country's most trusted children's author was always managing something inherently difficult to sustain. Once serious allegations from separate parts of that career started landing within a few years of each other, that balance became much harder to hold. Today, Walliams' public presence is a fraction of what it once was. He's made occasional appearances, including a supporting role in the film The Coral, released in late 2025, and a visit to Wimbledon that same year, but nothing close to the constant primetime visibility of the previous decade. Ironically, an entirely new generation discovered Little Britain in 2025 through short clips circulating on TikTok, often stripped of the context that once surrounded them, racking up millions of views and sparking online speculation about a potential revival even as the older controversy and the newer publishing scandal continued generating negative coverage elsewhere. No return to Britain's Got Talent has ever been discussed publicly, and Bruno Tonioli, his replacement on the panel, has held the seat for years now. The legal situation around the HarperCollins allegations remains unresolved as of the most recent reporting, with no formal conclusion announced on either side. His estimated net worth still sits at roughly $25 million, built across 3 decades of television, charity work, and book sales, a fortune that has stayed largely intact even as the reputation attached to it has taken repeated, serious hits. Whether that reputation can ever fully recover is genuinely an open question, and it isn't one Walliams himself appears able to answer with any confidence right now either. From swimming the length of the Thames to selling 60 million books, and from a beloved seat on one of Britain's biggest shows to 2 entirely separate scandals landing years apart, his story is a reminder of how much can unravel once private conversations and private allegations finally reach daylight, and how differently the public reacts depending on which version of the story they hear first. Which part of this surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the biggest names in British entertainment, subscribe for what's coming next.